This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, and welcome to my very first podcast called Unique Scotland. I'm John Harbour, and what I want to do in the coming weeks and months on my regular podcasts is to give you an insight into the real Scotland, and my future podcasts will attempt to cover almost every aspect of this amazing country. This podcast is on Scotland the place, the next one will be on Scotland the people, and after that I'll be doing a tour of Scotland up to Inverness and all the way back to Edinburgh. But I'll be covering subjects such as tartan, clans, weapons, lochs, whisky, to name just a few. For example, where does Scotland originate from? Scotland's people, where do they come from? Amazing places to visit, be they castles, and we've got many ruins, but some are still occupied by families that have been there for nearly 700 years. Palaces, the most famous of course, which is Holyrood, and still the residence of Her Majesty the Queen, when she comes to Scotland once a year. Battlefields, perhaps talk about the Jacobites and the battlefield just outside Inverness, Culloden, or simply talk about the incredible landscapes, the mountains. And of course we do have the highest mountain in Great Britain, Ben Nevis, at over 4,000 feet, and valleys, or glens as we call them in Scotland, and lochs. Perhaps I might talk about a monster or two, and I do hope that as you follow me on my journey through Scotland, you'll start to connect with a small but incredible country. We only have 5.5 million people, although we do have 7.5 million sheep, but with about 40 million of a Scottish diaspora worldwide, you may even have a connection. And whether you've already visited Scotland or you know of an ancestor who settled in your country after an arduous journey from these shores, then sit back, relax, and enjoy this journey that we are about to embark upon. Before I talk about Scotland the place, let me tell you a bit about me. The Scottish side of my family came from the very far north of Scotland. The name of the county is called Sutherland, but it is still known as Mackay country today, and it gives me great pride when I drive north to get to that boundary of Sutherland, and there's a huge granite obelisk marking that boundary, with Mackay country quite clearly marked in the granite. I always get out of the car, and I'm usually in my kilt, have a photograph taken, and survey the landscape. Many a battle was fought between the Mackays and the Sutherlands, and although they never defeated us by the sword, they were pretty wily by the pen, and they actually own most of the land of our ancestors. Now, I'm not bitter. It was a few hundred years ago, and we must let bygones be bygones. However, I will return to the theme of clans and their feuds and the legacy of many battles, but that's for another podcast. When I say my family come from the far north of Scotland, if you were to look at a map of Scotland, now that's not recommended if you're driving, but you will see in the far northwest corner Cape Wrath. Now my Uncle Ian was a lighthouse keeper of that particular lighthouse, but I'll talk about him shortly because that's who I went to visit and that's where the family home was. In the far northeast of the country you've got John O'Groats. Well, my family come from the small settlement of Skerra near Tongue, and it's about a third of the way along the coast from Cape Wrath. I recall the first time I visited my Uncle Ian on his croft in about 1985. I'd driven up in a Renault 14. Well, as I opened the door, it was then that I realised that a gale was blowing outside. Quick as a flash, the wind caught the door and violently swung it outwards. I heard the snap of the hinges first, followed quickly by the door slamming into the front of the car. I got out to try and close the door, now hanging half off its hinges, but it wouldn't budge. And later on I ended up returning to Edinburgh with string helping to keep it on. Anyway, I went down to the Croft House, which was a short walk down from the track where I'd parked the car, where I was met by my Uncle Ian and Auntie Betty, and I was welcomed in to a blazing peat fire, a hot cup of tea and a wee glass of scotch. I actually recall their first words were, "Aye, it's a bit windy out." Well, I was thinking, if that's a bit windy, I'd hate to be here when it really blows. Well, after tea we took a walk around the croft, and from the bottom of the garden, way below us, was a choppy sea. And in the distance I could see the outline of the Orkney Islands. "Don't walk too close, laddie, because if you fall over, your body will be cut to pieces on the way down before you're smashed to bits in the rocks below, and then you'll be washed away by the strong currents of the Pentland Firth, never to be seen again." Very straight talking was my Uncle Ian. Needless to say, I heeded his warning, and I'm here today to tell the tale. I'll talk a wee bit more about crofting later and what a tough life it really was. What a croft was effectively was a piece of land no more than about 12 acres, which you'd have to farm, so it was effectively subsistence living. It was a tough old life, but I'll talk about it in a later podcast. As I said, that's where the Scottish side of my family came from. My mother was Scottish, a Mackay, and my father was English, a Harbour, thus my surname, John Harbour. But there is a family story that my Scottish grandfather paid my father £half-a-crown, in old money it's about £10 today, for me to take his name, John Robert Mackay. Well, I'm pleased to say my father accepted the money, and I'm very proud to bear the name of John Robert Mackay, and of course remember my grandfather at the same time. Turning to my father's side, he was a coal miner, and I was brought up in a small mining village called Gorebridge, right next to Newton Grange. In fact, we lived in both places at one time or another. The mines have now all gone, replaced by other tech industries. But at the time, it was the norm for sons to follow their father's footsteps and go down the pit, as it was called, down the mine. Well, my father took me down once, and at the end of it, I was well and truly put off. I think that was the reason he took me down there, but also followed up with a threat to disown me if I went to the mines. Well, I realised what a wise decision that was, and I'm so pleased today, of course, that I didn't follow that career. However, before I go on, I would like to pay tribute to all the men who did go down into the mine and worked in appalling conditions to give us fuel for power. And I'd also like to pay tribute to my own father, Wilfred Harbour, who worked at the coalface with pick and shovel to put food on our table. What I did do, although I never went to the mines, I ran off to sea and joined the Royal Navy as a boy sailor. You never know, I might tell that story one day, but this podcast's about Scotland, so that'll have to wait. In the end, I served over 40 years and only retired about 7 years ago in the rank of commander. On leaving, I made it my mission to start my own wee business, and I think it was a relatively easy choice because I've got a love of Scotland and a love of Scottish history. Well, I love all history, to be honest, but that pointed me towards the tourism industry. I'd already travelled all over the world, and now I thought it was time for me to return home and travel all over Scotland and really connect with the beauty of this country and get to know all the places where history was made. While my colleagues were leaving to go into industry or non-exec directorships or even bursaries of schools, I chose to buy a large car and tour Scotland to my heart's content. Thus my business, Exclusive Scottish Visits, was born. And I'm delighted to say that I've had the pleasure of a large number of guests who have toured with me in the recent past, some of whom I hope are listening to this and recalling the wonderful places that we visited together. So effectively, I actually have a job which is a paid hobby, travelling all over Scotland. No complaints there. I still run the business, and you can have a look at past tours on the website of Exclusive Scottish Visits, but now it's time to diversify. I will of course still tour, but I'm hoping my podcast will reach far more people, many of whom probably won't get the chance to visit this country and share this experience. One other reason for diversifying is a wee bug called coronavirus. Sorry I've mentioned it, but it has rather brought the tourism industry to a halt. So as well as sharing Scotland with my clients, or guests I prefer to call them, in a practical sense, with me and my V-Class Mercedes people carrier, I can now do this from the comfort of my home and deliver it to the comfort of yours or wherever you are right now. It's really a bit spooky to think so many could be listening to this podcast. Well, I hope lots are listening to this podcast, but you're on trains or on the subway, you're lying on a beach, sitting on a bench, driving to work. Well, wherever you happen to be right now, I hope that I can bring Scotland to you by taking you with me on my virtual tour, and it may just prompt you to jump onto that outbound flight and come to this tiny but amazing country. Now let me tell you about this place, Scotland. Well, Scotland had to start somewhere, and although the world is considered to be 3 billion years old, I want to start a mere 500 million years ago, when Scotland's mass was floating on a tectonic plate somewhere south of the equator, so it must have been warm. I mean, we've come a long way since then, as you can tell when you come to Scotland and have to wear woolies and a fleece. Anyway, I want to start all those years ago, and I promise not to bamboozle you with geology. Not that I could, but how Scotland formed from those early beginnings has dictated the landform and the population distribution in Scotland that we know and love today. So, where do we start? Well, around 500 million years ago, Scotland was floating on a tectonic plate as part of a continent called Laurentia, and was separated from England on the Avalonian continent by an ocean known as the Iapetus. Through tectonic plate movement, the ocean closed, and these plates then collided. And they collided with the Baltica plate, effectively Scandinavia. The closing of the Iapetus was the greatest geological event which produced the basic structure of Scotland during its mountain building period, and this period is known by its official name as the Caledonia orogeny, Caledonia being another word for Scotland. Of course, these events were happening over millions of years, and the movements continue to push the separate entities of Scotland together in a sliding movement, northeast, southwest. And where these collisions took place are where we find our geological fault lines in Scotland today, with the Great Glen and the Highland Boundary Fault easily recognisable in the landscape. Anyway, one fact probably unknown to many is that America was part of that tectonic plate movement, and after the split from Europe, it headed off to the west. Now we're talking about hundreds of millions of years, so it took a while to get to where it is today, but it's still moving at about half an inch a year. So your question for today is, how long will it take for America to have moved so far that it would be more economic to come to Scotland from the USA using the Pacific rather than the Atlantic route? Please send an email to me if you have an answer. This coming together of continents have left their mark on our present-day Scotland, and we see very clearly from the types of rock substrata that there are a number of clear geological fault lines that determine Scotland's topography of today. The Highland Boundary Fault, for example, runs all the way from Stonehaven through Inverness, down through Loch Lomond to Helensburgh, which is the town where I am living, and I'm actually recording this from Helensburgh right at this very moment. It's strange, I watched the film San Andreas recently, where the seismologist Dr. Hayes discovers that the entire San Andreas fault is shifting and will soon cause a series of major earthquakes, potentially destroying cities along the fault line. Well, my town is sitting on a fault line. Just makes you think. Anyway, as you drive up through Scotland, it's clear how topography changes. In the west, you've got the Highlands, which appear as spectacular, rugged mountains with deeply indented glacial troughs, and they now form the lochs such as Loch Ness and Loch Lomond that we all know so well. The west coast's craggy coastline, whereas the east is less mountainous and is the base of the prevailing water flow. I say the base of the prevailing water flow because, without going into too much detail, there was a gigantic volcanic event which effectively tilted Scotland up slightly on the west side, so rivers generally run from the west to the east. The borders area, on the other hand, south of Scotland, is one of rolling hills mainly covered in glacial deposits, with heather moors and conifer forests. Now, if time had stood still after the collision of the continents, then a very different Scotland would be seen today. But erosive elements of rain, wind, ice and heat over the next 50 million years gouged out what has become the Scottish landscape of today, with rugged mountains in the west and relatively smooth coastline to the east. Okay, that's the geology. That wasn't too bad, was it? The final act in the changing of the landscape of Scotland was a climatic one, and the climate changed about 2 million years ago, when Scotland was subjected to an ice age that only ended about 10,000 years ago. Substantial quantities of ice formed on the top of the mountains and moved slowly from the highlands in the west, expanding all the way to the lower ground in the east. Some glaciers were as much as 1.5 miles thick, and as it moved across the country, it scoured the mountain surfaces, dragging with it rocks and debris that acted like sandpaper on the surface of the countryside. Now, when the ice melted, it dumped huge amounts of debris all over Scotland, and these deposits can still be seen today. Sometimes as I drive around Scotland, I'm often asked where the stone came from to build the Neolithic monuments of 4,000 years ago, the brocks of 2,000 years ago, or the castles of 1,000 years ago, or the stone cottages 200 to 300 years old, and add to that the endless rows of boundary stone walls, or dry stone dykes as we call them in Scotland. Well, now you know, all the glacial debris. Stones big and small. We call them boulders. There's a good Scottish word for you, boulders. And were all left behind when the glaciers melted. A really good example of the erosive effect of ice on the landscape can be seen in the central lowlands, the area between Edinburgh and Glasgow, where volcanic plugs, the remnants of the volcanoes, were left behind because the basalt structure was too tough to move and the glacier actually had to go around them. You can really see the effects of this when you look at Edinburgh and Stirling Castle, enormous craggy rocky structures with the stone fortifications built on top. It's called a crag and tail, and as the glacier hit the crag, it had to go round, leaving a tail all the way down from the top of the crag. And if you look at Edinburgh and Stirling today, the reason why when you approach the castle you're always climbing up a fairly substantial hill. It's important to understand how Scotland formed, because the people that arrived after the last ice age, some 8 to 10,000 years ago, we're not really quite sure, would have been confronted by a land devoid of humans, totally covered in trees, freshwater rivers filled with fish, animals to hunt in abundance, and yet the same obstacles to cross that Scots have had to face throughout history. And Scotland's beauty comes from the photogenic mountainous west coast with the heather glens and the deep lochs bordering the fierce Atlantic Ocean, whereas on the east there are more rounded hills with good arable farming, and it's generally flatter leading down to the more benign North Sea, and that's kept fishermen busy for thousands of years. And that is what we see today. And if you're fortunate enough to come to Scotland on tour, then the image I've just painted will become so clear as you move from south to north and east to west. And just to finish off on the subject of climate, I'd like to point out that the north of Scotland is in a similar latitude to that of Moscow. And yet, whereas Moscow can be sitting at minus 20 degrees centigrade, Scotland can be up at plus 5. The reason for that is the Gulf Stream that runs all the way up the left-hand side of the west coast of the United Kingdom. And sometimes even on the west coast, you'll find palm trees and relatively mild conditions even in the middle of the winter. Early settlers would have chosen the lower land to farm and to fish, and these settlements would have been near to rivers or the sea, and there's much evidence of ancient structures such as burial cairns, which are huge piles of stones over a grave. Yes, even Bronze Age man used the glacial deposits. And other fortifications such as brocks, which were tall round towers usually built on top of the hills to give good all-round vision, and were built about 2,000 years ago. The successors to brocks were the ancient castles that still stand all over Scotland today. Built over 1,000 years ago, some still serving the families that built them, and of course the royal castles, beautiful, majestic structures such as Edinburgh and Stirling. And I'll go into castles in general in a subsequent podcast. And now what we see in the geography of Scotland is an extremely varied landscape, from rural lowlands to unspoilt uplands, from large cities to sparsely inhabited islands. Of course, I've talked only about Scotland's forming after the huge geological event, but it is, of course, only 1/3 of the island of Great Britain. It also has 750 surrounding islands, and that includes the far northern isles of the Orkneys and the Shetlands. And if you remember earlier, I told you that I could see the Orkneys from the garden of my Uncle Ian's croft. There are also over 31,000 fresh water lochs. Yes, I said 31,000. And these range from the massive lochs, such as Loch Lomond and Loch Ness, which are about 24 miles long, to tiny lochans, some with no name. Yes, it is incredible and gives an indication of the diversity of the landscape and, of course, the amount of rain we get, especially on the west coast. In terms of size, Scotland's about 31,000 square miles. Its only land border is with England, which runs 60 miles from east to west. The island of Ireland lies 13 miles to the west of the Scottish mainland, and in the other direction to the east, Norway is about 190 miles away across the North Sea. Because of the terrain that I've talked about, the population centres are mainly in the south of Scotland, or central lowlands, that is, as it is called. Most early Scots settled here or on the east coast. They were also relatively close to trading partners across the North Sea from Norway, Holland, Belgium and France. If we look at the main areas of population today, then the cities that have grown up occupy the same places our ancestors occupied, all dictated by the geology of the land. There are 7 main areas, populations, cities. That's Edinburgh, Glasgow, Stirling, Dundee, Perth, Aberdeen and Inverness. And apart from Glasgow, most of them sit either to the south or on the east coast of Scotland. Edinburgh has about 750,000 people, Glasgow about 1 million. Edinburgh remains the capital city. Of course, it's got its royal and parliamentary connections, which date back hundreds of years. And the Highlands and the Islands are probably the most sparsely populated in Europe. Scotland has an abundance of natural resources such as iron, zinc, coal. And if you remember that Scotland had been floating south of the equator some 500 million years ago, well, at that time we had a fabulous tropical rainforest in our midst, and that eventually turned into the coal, or the fuel source that fed Scotland's 19th century industrial revolution. Oil was also discovered a few years ago in the North Sea, and Scotland, surprisingly, is the largest producer of petroleum in the European Union. And as I produce this podcast, I've been watching the news, and it looks like the oil price has crashed, so that's not going to help our balance of payments. However, Scotland has other natural resources, as you will discover when you visit, and that is wind. The damn thing that blew the door off my beloved Renault 14 all those years ago. Well, that wind is now driving the green energy revolution and will, I'm sure, play an important part in power production as the world starts to turn away from fossil fuels. So you now have a good idea of this place we call Scotland. And what do you have to look forward to today? Well, if you visit, I can promise the following: towering mountains, glittering lochs, and perhaps dip your toes in the cool, crisp water, deep glens, heather-covered rolling hills, lush farmland of the lowlands with acres of whisky-making barley swaying in the breeze. Perhaps visit one of our 135 distilleries, or perhaps play on one of our 600 golf courses. Yes, 600. And maybe even the old course, the home of golf. That's where golf started. Miles of deserted golden sandy beaches, craggy coastlines where you can walk by the sea for miles around without seeing a single soul. Or you can visit the ruined castles that can be found all over Scotland, and also the castles and palaces still occupied today. You can visit Edinburgh, the capital city, with its old town dating back to the 16th century, or Glasgow, a more modern city built on the fortunes made from tobacco, sugar and silk. Or try and find Nessie while cruising Loch Ness, or visit the Neolithic settlement Maes Howe, almost intact in the Orkney Islands. Or perhaps search the clanlands to find an ancestral connection, to see where and how our ancestors lived. All this awaits you, and in my next podcast I will talk about the Scottish people, where we come from originally, and you'll be surprised how our society was formed. What is a real Scotsman or woman? So please join me next time to find out exactly where the Scottish people came from and what it is to be a real Scot.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.